The world knows them as the architects of the California sound, the guitar wizard and the meticulous craftsman. For 5 decades, Joe Walsh and Don Henley have shared private jets, sold-out stadiums, and a brotherhood forged in the fires of rock and roll history. But behind the polished harmonies of the Eagles lies a more complex reality. For years, rumors of a deep-seated friction and a dictatorship within the band have persisted, leaving fans to wonder what truly happens when the stage lights go dark. Now, at 78, Joe Walsh is finally stepping forward to peel back the layers of their partnership. He isn't interested in tabloid drama, he is ready to speak on the psychological reality of working alongside one of music's most demanding perfectionists. What happens to a wild card when he meets a man who demands total control? The answer isn't a simple story of a fight, it's a story of how 2 very different men survived each other. In the mid-1970s, the Eagles were the kings of soft rock, but they were standing at a crossroads. They had the hits, but they were missing a certain edge that could take them into the stratosphere. Enter Joe Walsh. To the public, Joe was the clown prince of rock, a man known for his chaotic energy, chainsawing hotel furniture, and playing some of the most legendary guitar riffs in history. He was a free spirit, a wild card, who lived for the thrill of the moment. On the other side of the room stood Don Henley. Don was the disciplined, cerebral heart of the band, a man who viewed music as a sacred craft that required absolute precision. When Joe joined the band in 1975, it was a collision of 2 completely different worlds. Joe was coming from the James Gang and a successful solo career, but he was tired of carrying the weight of the spotlight alone. He was looking for a family, a group of brothers where he could fit in. Don, however, wasn't looking for a brother to party with, he was looking for a professional to help him build an empire. In those early rehearsals, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Joe would show up ready to jam and see where the music took them. Don would show up with a clear vision of exactly how every drum beat and every vocal harmony should sound. Joe describes these early days not as a battle, but as a fascinating study in human nature. He deeply admired Don's brilliance and his ability to write lyrics that defined a generation. But he also felt the first flickers of a very rigid structure. In Don's world, there was a right way to do things, and there was everything else. For a man like Joe, who thrived on spontaneity, this was a culture shock. He began to realize that joining the Eagles wasn't just about playing guitar, it was about entering a world governed by a very specific set of rules. While the music they created together was nearly perfect, a silent question began to haunt the recording studio: could Joe's wild spirit truly survive in a world governed by Don Henley's strict rules, or would the pressure to be perfect eventually break him? As the band moved toward the creation of the legendary Hotel California album, the atmosphere changed. It was no longer just about making music, it was about achieving a level of perfection that few human beings could sustain. Don Henley's pursuit of excellence was no longer just a work ethic, it had become a way of life that dictated every second spent in the studio. Joe recalls days that felt less like a creative session and more like a high-stakes surgery. He would spend hours, sometimes even days, recording a single guitar part over and over. Don would listen with an ear for the tiniest imperfection, a note that was a fraction of a second off or a tone that didn't perfectly match the vision in his head. To Don, anything less than flawless was a failure. He believed that the audience deserved nothing but the best, and he was willing to push himself and everyone else to the brink to get it. But to Joe, the flaws were what made music feel alive. He missed the dirt and the soul of a first take. This created a deep psychological toll. Joe began to feel less like a creative partner and more like a hired gun or a specialized tool used to complete Don's vision. The joy of playing was slowly being replaced by the fear of making a mistake. This chapter explores the loneliness that comes with being in the world's biggest band. When you are at the top, the pressure to stay there is immense. Joe speaks about the mounting tension in the room, the long silences, the frustrated glances, and the weight of Don's expectations. To cope, Joe leaned further into his party boy persona, using humor and chaos to distract himself from the rigid atmosphere. But behind the jokes, there was a growing sense of vulnerability. He was a man who needed freedom to breathe, trapped in an environment where the air was getting thinner every day. The tension wasn't just about the music anymore, it was about personal survival. Joe reveals the exact moment during a tour when he realized that being an Eagle might mean losing his own identity entirely to satisfy Don's demand for control. When the Eagles finally imploded in 1980 after a famously disastrous benefit concert, the public was told it was due to creative differences. But Joe Walsh points to a much deeper, more painful emotional exhaustion. The band hadn't just broken up, they had burned out. This led to a 14-year period often called the Long Vacation, where the members of the band went their separate ways. For Joe, this was a time of wandering. While Don Henley's solo career skyrocketed with hits like The Boys of Summer, Joe struggled. He was still the funny guitar guy, but without the structure of the band, his personal life began to spiral. During these silent years, the distance between Joe and Don grew into a vast, quiet canyon. They didn't speak. They didn't check in. Joe reflects on how he viewed Don during this era, not as a villain, but as a reminder of a time when the music had become a heavy burden. He watched from afar as Don became a serious political activist and a solo superstar, seemingly moving on with ease. Meanwhile, Joe felt stuck in the past, struggling with his own demons and the shadow of the Eagles' legacy. This chapter highlights Joe's internal battle with his identity. He had spent years being the wild card in Don's deck, and now that the deck was scattered, he didn't know who he was. He missed the brotherhood, but he didn't miss the pressure. He realized that his time with Don had left deep psychological scars, a feeling that he was only valuable if he was performing perfectly. He describes the quiet bitterness that can grow when you feel like you were never truly seen for who you were, but only for what you could provide to the group. For over a decade, it seemed like the book had closed on their partnership forever. But then, a single, unexpected phone call changed everything, but it came with a difficult condition that Joe wasn't sure he was ready to meet. In 1994, the impossible happened, the Eagles reunited for the Hell Freezes Over tour. For Joe, this wasn't just a chance to play music again or a way to earn a massive paycheck. It was a matter of life and death. By the early 90s, Joe's health and personal life were in a dangerous place. When the talk of a reunion began, Don Henley did something that would change the course of Joe's life forever. He made it clear that the band would only get back together if Joe got sober. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a requirement. This created a completely new and complex dynamic between the two men. Don wasn't just a bandmate anymore, he was a catalyst for Joe's survival. Don and Glenn Frey supported Joe as he entered rehab and began the difficult journey of sobriety. While this was an act of profound kindness, it added a new layer of emotional complexity to their relationship. How do you find your own voice when you owe your very life to the person you are working for? Joe describes the psychological shift from being an equal partner to feeling like a student or a project. As they hit the road again, the old power dynamics returned. Don was still the meticulous leader, and the rehearsals were still grueling. But now, Joe was navigating it all with a clear head for the first time. He felt a deep sense of gratitude toward Don, but he also felt the familiar walls of Don's control closing in. He had to learn how to be a sober, independent man while still fitting into the highly managed machine that Don required. It was a delicate dance of showing appreciation without losing his independence. This chapter explores the struggle of being the guy who got saved, and the secret resentment that can sometimes grow alongside a debt of gratitude. As the years passed and the band continued to tour the world, Joe began to notice a subtle change in Don, a side of him that no one else seemed to see. It was a vulnerability that challenged everything Joe thought he knew about the General. For decades, the public image of the Eagles was that of a strict hierarchy. Don Henley was often portrayed as the General, a man who ruled with an iron fist, while Joe Walsh was the loyal soldier, who just showed up and played. In this chapter, Joe finally addresses the dictator rumors that have followed Don for 50 years. With the perspective of a man who has seen it all, Joe provides a much more nuanced view. He explains that Don didn't act like a tyrant because he enjoyed power or wanted to make people feel small. Instead, Don's behavior was fueled by a deep-seated, almost paralyzing fear of failure. Joe breaks down the psychological weight Don carried, especially after the passing of Glenn Frey. When Glenn died, the foundation of the band was shaken to its core. Don felt that the entire legacy of the Eagles, every song, every memory, every fan's expectation, rested solely on his shoulders. This made him even more protective, more meticulous, and more controlling. He wasn't trying to be a boss, he was trying to be a guardian. Joe reflects on what it felt like to be the soldier in this environment. He realized that his role wasn't just to play guitar, but to provide a sense of stability and lightheartedness that Don was unable to give himself. Joe speaks about the quiet moments backstage, away from the cameras and the crowds. He saw the toll that leadership took on Don, the exhaustion, the stress, and the isolation of being at the top. The truth about their relationship started to emerge not through a big argument, but through these quiet observations. It wasn't a story of one man bullying another. It was a story of two aging men trying to uphold a legendary status that was becoming heavier with every passing year. Joe began to see Don not as a dictator, but as a man who was trapped by his own standards. But even with this new understanding, a final confrontation was brewing. There was one specific moment on their final tour that would force Joe to finally speak his mind about the way Don treated the people around them. Now 78 years old, Joe Walsh is at a point in his life where he no longer feels the need to protect images or hide behind jokes. He is looking back with the clarity that only decades of shared history can provide. In his recent reflections, Joe has finally confirmed the truth that many fans have suspected but never truly understood. The truth isn't a scandalous story of backstabbing or hatred. Instead, it is a profound realization about human nature. Joe explains that Don Henley is a man who loves the Eagles so much that he is terrified of anything hurting it, and that includes the people inside the band. Joe describes his ultimate realization: Don's controlling nature is a paradox. It is the very thing that kept the Eagles alive and relevant for 50 years, ensuring that every show was perfect and every record was a masterpiece. However, it is also the thing that made the band feel like a golden cage for Joe and the other members. Joe finally understands that he stopped fighting Don's control not because he was weak, but because he saw the fear behind it. He realized that Don needed to be in control to feel safe, and Joe, in his own way, decided to let him have it for the sake of the music. The relationship has transitioned into a space of quiet, mutual acceptance. They aren't the kind of best friends who hang out every day, but they share a bond that is much deeper. Joe reveals that the most honest conversations they have now are often wordless, shared looks on stage or a nod of approval after a difficult set. The truth that Joe confirms is a heartbreaking and beautiful look at the loneliness of a perfectionist and the resilience of a partner who chose peace over pride. Joe admits that they are both difficult in their own ways, but they are survivors of a rock and roll war that only the two of them truly understand. He has found a way to be his own man while still respecting the boundaries of the world Don built. With the truth finally out in the open, one final question remains for the fans and for the band. After the stadium lights fade for the very last time, what is the final legacy these two men will leave behind? This chapter brings the long, winding journey of Joe Walsh and Don Henley full circle. It reflects on how their partnership has transformed from a collision of egos in the 70s to a graceful, if complicated, alliance in the present day. Joe offers a final, profound insight into human nature that resonates far beyond the world of rock music. He suggests that we often clash most intensely with the people who provide exactly what we are missing in ourselves. For Joe, Don provided the structure, the discipline, and the professional anchor he needed to survive the chaos of his youth. For Don, Joe provided the spark, the relatability, and the human soul that kept his meticulous compositions from feeling cold or mechanical. As they perform on their final Long Goodbye tour, the atmosphere has changed. The old tension that once felt like a coiled spring has been replaced by a weary, respectful grace. When they stand on stage together now, it's not about who is in charge or who is playing the loudest solo. It's about the fact that they are still there, still standing, while so many of their peers have faded away. Joe's confirmation of the truth serves as a powerful lesson for all of us, that relationships do not have to be perfect, or even particularly easy, to be deeply meaningful. The narrative concludes with Joe looking out at the audience, seeing generations of fans who have been moved by the music he and Don made together. He realizes that the struggle was part of the process. The truth is that without the friction, there would have been no fire. Joe's journey is a story of forgiveness, not just for Don's controlling nature, but for his own mistakes and the roles they were both forced to play to keep the legend alive. They have reached a point where the music is the only thing that matters, and the old grievances have finally been laid to rest in the name of a final, beautiful harmony. As the curtain slowly closes on the Eagles' final tour, Joe leaves the audience with one final thought: if you had to choose between being completely free and being part of something legendary, which would you pick? For Joe Walsh and Don Henley, the answer is written in every note they play. We conclude this deep dive by looking at the lasting impact of Joe Walsh's honesty. By finally speaking his truth at 78, he hasn't tarnished the Eagles' brand or caused a new rift. Instead, he has humanized a story that often felt like a Hollywood myth. His willingness to discuss the psychological weight of working with a man like Don Henley gives fans a much deeper appreciation for the music. We now see that Hotel California or Desperado weren't just products of talent, but products of a very real, very human struggle between two different ways of seeing the world. Joe's journey from the wild card to a wise elder statesman is now complete. He is a man at peace, no longer needing to hide behind the party boy mask or use humor to deflect from his feelings. He stands beside Don Henley today not as a subordinate, but as a brother who finally understands the man behind the curtain. Their story reminds us that even the most successful people in the world deal with the same issues we do: the need for control, the fear of being seen, and the struggle to find balance in a long-term partnership. The legacy of Joe and Don is one of endurance. They proved that you can work through decades of silence, resentment, and power struggles to reach a place of mutual respect. Joe's final confirmation isn't a tell-all meant to hurt, it's a tell-all meant to heal. It's a reminder that at the end of the day, the people we struggle with the most are often the ones who help us become who we were meant to be. Joe Walsh's story shows us that even the greatest legends are human. Does Joe's perspective on Don's leadership change how you hear the Eagles' music today? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this look behind the scenes, consider following along for more stories of the human journeys behind the world's biggest icons. Thank you for watching.